Well, thank you, John, for that very generous introduction. What we're facing today is a global problem which, despite the evident complacency with which it's largely been greeted since the end of the Cold War, is equivalent in gravity to that of climate change, a problem which simply defies such complacency and which must be tackled with much more conviction and effectiveness than we've managed so far. The present reality is this: 20 years after the end of the Cold War, there are at least 23,000 nuclear warheads still in existence, nearly every one of them having many times, sometimes many hundreds of times, the destructive power of the bomb that devastated Hiroshima. Over 9,000 of them are in the hands of the US, another 13,000 in the hands of Russia, and around 1,000 with the other nuclear-armed states combined: China, France, the UK, Israel, India and Pakistan. Nearly half of all these weapons, some 10,000 of them, remain actually operationally deployed. And most extraordinarily of all, over 2,000 of them, all in Russian and US hands, remain on hair trigger alert, ready to be launched on warning in the event of a perceived attack, with a decision window for each country's president of 4 to 8 minutes. And given what we now know about how many times the very sophisticated command and control systems of the Cold War years were strained by mistakes and false alarms, and what we both know now and can guess about how much more sophisticated cyber attacks on defence systems may get in the years ahead, it's hard to believe that our Cold War luck can continue in perpetuity. In the years since the Cold War ended, moreover, we've seen the beginnings of a breakdown in the non-proliferation system, which, despite many forebodings, had held together remarkably for the first 30 years of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT's existence. India and Pakistan, who'd never signed the treaty, joined the undeclared Israel as a fully fledged nuclear-armed state in 1998, with each of them now possessing at least 60 warheads, and in the case of Israel, probably closer to 200. North Korea has thumbed its nose at the NPT, purporting to walk away from it, and now likely to have 5 or 6 nuclear explosive devices of its own. Although it's currently regarded as a kind of backslider capable of redemption rather than being a fully fledged nuclear-armed state. Iran, with its uranium enrichment program, probably now has weapon-making capability if it chooses to go down that path. With these developments all occurring in the world's most volatile regions, with less reason to be confident about weapons security and command systems than in the case of the longer-established nuclear powers, and with considerable potential for what's been described as a cascade of proliferation, should Iran in particular go over the top, the risk of something going badly wrong with all of this is disconcertingly high. Add to all that now the risk of terrorist actors getting their hands on the makings of a nuclear weapon, or much more easily, a so-called dirty bomb, combining conventional explosives with radioactive materials like hospital isotopes, which, if it happened, would generate nothing like the casualties of a fission or a fusion bomb, but certainly have a psychological impact, I think we could guess, at least equal to 9/11. We can no longer be under any illusion about the intent of certain messianic groups to cause destruction on this kind of massive scale. And although the probability is small and probably lower than some alarmist accounts have suggested, their capacity of terrorist groups to put together a Hiroshima-sized nuclear device using manageable technology, which has long been in the public domain, and back-channel sourcing of the kind that the AQ Khan network taught us to be alarmed about, and to explode it from the inside of a large delivery van in Trafalgar Square or Times Square or Federation Square, causing in each case hundreds of thousands of deaths and injuries, none of this capacity can be underestimated. This means that major continuing efforts have to be made not only in policing and intelligence, but in securing loose weapons and material, and in trying to reduce the number of potential sources of new weapons-grade nuclear material. There are also potentially significant risks in this context associated with the likely rapid expansion of civil nuclear energy in the decades ahead, in response not least to the need for non-fossil fuel contributions to baseload electricity generation. The present total of 436 nuclear power reactors worldwide is expected to grow, even with the long planning and construction lead times involved and taking into account closures along the way. It's expected to grow to as many as a net 800 by 2030, with many new countries taking up this option in that time frame. And if effective measures are not sustained at both the front and the back ends of the nuclear fuel cycle, including through the creation of multilateral fuel banks and the like, the persuasion of new countries not to get into the fuel production process at all, this civil nuclear renaissance could mean a great deal more fissile material becoming available for destructive purposes. What all this adds up to, as I said at the outset, is a threat to the world as we know it if things start going really wrong, which is absolutely commensurable, but much more immediate in its impact than that from global warming. Nuclear weapons are the only weapons ever invented that have the capacity to wholly destroy life on this planet as we know it. And to do so with the arsenals we now possess, taking into account the technical refinement of current weapons, the combination of blast, radiation and nuclear winter effects many times over. They have a blast capacity alone equivalent to 2,300 million tonnes of TNT. Think of that, 2,300 million tonnes of TNT, which actually adds up to something like 150,000 Hiroshima-scale explosions, or putting it yet another way, 760 times the combined destructive power of every bomb used by every combatant in World War II. There was a period of extremely productive disarmament and threat reduction activity immediately following the end of the Cold War. A flurry of treaties and agreements, scores of thousands of warheads being decommissioned, bringing the global stockpile down to its present 23,000 from an almost unbelievable 70,000 at the height of the Cold War. There was the agreed indefinite extension of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. There was the opening for signature of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, and whole categories of weapons, notably in the shorter ranges, were abandoned. Countries with nuclear options like Belarus, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, Brazil, Argentina decided not to pursue them. South Africa actually gave up the half dozen or so weapons that it had developed and were in its possession. But for the best part of the following decade, the last decade, one can only describe the attitude of most policymakers around the world as sleepwalking or worse. Efforts were made to introduce new non-proliferation disciplines, not least in the aftermath of 9/11, and with the emergence of the North Korean and the Iranian problems. But on the disarmament side, the response was at best neglect and at worst mockery, as with many contributions of the Bush administration's Ambassador John Bolton in particular. This was hardly calculated to win a positive response from the non-nuclear weapon states being asked to do more on the proliferation side, and of course it didn't. The wheel, however, has now turned again. First with the hugely influential published articles in 2007 and 2008 of the four United States realist cold warriors, Kissinger, Shultz, Nunn and Perry, arguing, rather startlingly, given their background, that the risks of retaining nuclear weapons actually outweighed any possible usefulness. And above all, of course, the wheel has now turned with the election of President Barack Obama. Strongly personally committed to moving toward a world without nuclear weapons, as he made abundantly clear in his Prague speech in April, he's shown himself equally determined to deliver quite quickly some dramatic forward movement, starting with the bilateral negotiations with Russia, on which President Medvedev has himself also been very responsive, to achieve a further round of deep cuts in each side's deployed strategic weapons. This has in turn injected some positive vibrations into the preparatory process for next year's Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference, following the disastrous failure to agree on anything at all last time round in 2005. And it's also injected some life into the long, stalemated and moribund negotiations at the UN's Conference on Disarmament in Geneva on a treaty to cut off any further production of fissile material for weapon-making purposes. So, this is the environment, a very much more positive one than even just a year ago, in which the International Commission on Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, which on the invitation of Kevin Rudd and the former Japanese Prime Minister Fukuda, I'm co-chairing along with my Japanese counterpart, former Foreign Minister Yoriko Kawaguchi. And this is the doing the work that I want to now talk to you about in a little bit more detail. It's a fair question to ask about a commission like this right at the outset. Well, why Australia, why Japan? What could possibly also be the value added by yet another high-level group of the great and the good when we already have a multitude of such reporting panels, notably the Canberra Commission on the Elimination of Nuclear Weapons, Hans Blix's Weapons of Mass Destruction Commission, there's the Tokyo Forum for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, and there's also, which you probably haven't heard of, the Commission of Eminent Persons on the International Atomic Energy Agency's future, led recently by former Mexican President Ernesto Zedillo. Well, I think this first question is easy enough to answer. Japan has the credentials of being the only country, of course, ever to suffer nuclear attack, and also being a long-standing leading international campaigner for nuclear disarmament. Australia, although I have to say not in any spirit of partisan ugliness, has been among the policy sleepwalkers in the last decade, has, when you look back a little bit further, historically has been in the forefront of international disarmament and non-proliferation activity, with the Canberra Commission of 1996, to which this present commission is a natural successor, being the first actually initiated by a sovereign government to make a strong intellectual case for a world without nuclear weapons. We also, as Australians, I believe, have the moral responsibility that comes with the world's largest uranium reserves to ensure that they're not misused. While, of course, it's the case that the crucial leadership on most major issues here will have to come from the US and Russia, who, between them, as you've heard, possess over 95% of the world's nuclear warheads, a great deal of buy-in still has to come from many other countries if progress is to be made. And Australia, with its well-established reputation as an active, engaged, creative middle power, has, I think, working with Japan, greater capacity than many to energise the necessary multilateral response. When it comes to value added, I think we've got a reasonable story again to tell. The first element's the timeliness of this enterprise. Rather than just trying to hold the line against a tide of indifference, as past panels have largely done, we all have the sense with the arrival of the Obama administration that we are, for the moment anyway, riding something of a wave. Our current objective is to have our major report out by the end of this year or very early next year, with plenty of time then for its ideas to feed into next year's big future-shaping event, as I've said, the NPT, Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference, which takes place in May. The second contributor to our value, I think, will be the very high level and broadly representative character of the 15-member Commission. Participants, although each of them are acting in their personal capacities, from all the nuclear weapon states under the NPT, including former US Defence Secretary Bill Perry, Baroness Shirley Williams from the UK. We've also got representatives from the nuclear armed states of India and Pakistan outside the NPT, and from a very good cross-section globally and regionally of the key non-weapon states, including former Prime Minister Gro Harlem Brundtland of Norway and President Zedillo of Mexico. The third value-added point to make, I think, is that we've adopted a very highly consultative approach, with Commission and other regional outreach meetings having been held so far in Washington, Moscow, Beijing, Santiago, Chile, and others planned in just a few weeks' time for Cairo and New Delhi. We've got a very distinguished global advisory board, and we're working with 9 research centres across 5 continents, which are contributing a very steady stream of research and input into the work of the Commission. So we're doing all right on consultation. The fourth element is, I think, the intended comprehensiveness of this Commission's product, whereas others in the past have tended just to focus almost solely on the disarmament piece of the puzzle or the non-proliferation side of it, or sometimes the civil energy side. We are very much giving attention to all three, with all the cross-connections and interdependency between them. The fifth element that should add value, I think, to the Commission's work is that we intend to be very realistic in the way in which we approach our task. Certainly to keep up in lights the objective of a nuclear weapon-free world, but also to accompany the idealism with a pretty strong measure of pragmatism, reflecting the geopolitical realities of the world around us. We have to recognise the constraints as they're perceived to exist by all the key players, and not think that we'll carry the day simply with moral pronouncements. We can all, like Shakespeare's Glendower, summon spirits from the vasty deep. But of course the real question, as Hotspur witheringly responded, is, will they come? A sixth element and the value we're seeking to add is to write the report in a way that will be actually readable and accessible to non-specialists. Far too many contributions to the public debate in this area have been produced by specialists for other specialists, by wonks for wonks, succumbing to the pleasures of what I'd like to call acronymphomania, using terminology and assuming a level of understanding of basic technical issues which frankly is just not there among senior policy makers. If we want to energise a high-level debate, we have to produce a product that's actually going to be read, capable of being read and understood by the high-level players and those in the media and elsewhere that we really do need to influence them. The very last thing to say about the value added by the Commission is that we're intending to produce a report which is very action-oriented, drawing clear attention as to who should be doing what, when and how all the various different policy elements come together over the short, the medium and the long term. Well, in terms of what we'll actually be recommending, it's a little bit difficult for me to be too specific about this just now because the Commission is still meeting to decide. It's all very much work in progress. But I'll try to give you just a quick summary of the major themes that are emerging. In the short term, which we are defining as the next 4 years, the immediate objective has to be securing a successful outcome for this NPT review conference next year. That will mean, in our view, reaching agreement on measures to strengthen the NPT regime, including improved safeguards, verification, compliance, enforcement measures. It'll mean measures to improve the effectiveness of the International Atomic Energy Agency itself. It'll mean trying to reach an agreed forward-looking statement on disarmament issues from the weapon states. And hopefully it will also mean reaching agreement on ways to at least move forward a few steps on the ever-burning issue of a nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East, which has the capacity, as always, to be a bit of a showstopper in this NPT context. Other critical issues for the short term are to find a way through the dangerous impasses in Iran and North Korea, for the US and Russia to successfully complete their current negotiations on deep reductions in offensive strategic weapons and to commence a whole round of new talks on further deep cuts to all classes of weapons, for there to be at least the commencement of a serious process of multilateralising disarmament strategy, initially through major strategic dialogues between the United States and China, but also through the engagement of all the other weapon states and the nuclear armed states outside the NPT. There needs to be, in the short term also, the complete implementation of cooperative threat reduction and other programs which are designed to secure against misuse, so-called loose nuclear weapons, loose materials, loose technology worldwide. And finally, there's an urgent short-term need for the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty to be finally ratified into force and for there to be major progress in those Geneva negotiations I've already mentioned on banning the future production of fissile material usable in nuclear weapons. That's a pretty long and ambitious agenda, to be sure, but it's not a totally quixotic one if we can build quickly on the momentum which is now showing itself to be there. For the medium term, which we're defining as 2025, which sounds rather a long way away, but in fact is rather ambitious given the scale of the changes we have in mind, the main objective here has to be to make really dramatic progress in nuclear disarmament. Not just non-proliferation, all that stuff, but with a massive reduction in the overall number of nuclear warheads, both deployed and actually stuffed away in stocks, both strategic and tactical in character. The Commission is still debating as to whether we can be confident about nominating specific target numbers for this minimisation phase, both overall and for specific countries, but we're certainly conscious that the more specific we can realistically be, the more practically useful as a blueprint our report will be. We also see the medium-term disarmament objective, hopefully in this case achieved a lot earlier than 2025, as being to have all the nuclear armed states become genuinely committed to reducing to the point of invisibility the role or salience of nuclear weapons in their national security policies. And that means having them sign up to nuclear doctrine based on the principle of no first use, and matching that with a physical deployment of their weapons and their launch readiness status that actually makes such declaratory statements credible. If we can achieve by 2025 a world in which the numbers are very low, in the very low hundreds hopefully as compared with the 20,000s plus at the moment, if we can create a world in which everybody is signed up to a no first use doctrine, or at the very least one accepting that the sole purpose of nuclear weapons is to deter their use against other nuclear weapons, if we can have a world where all the nuclear armed states are organising their military resources in a way that actually reflects that doctrine, with operational deployments absolutely minimal and relating only to ensuring the survivability of some retaliatory capability, and where launch decision times bear no resemblance to today's very alarming hair-trigger alert status, I think if we can get that kind of a world, we would all acknowledge that we'd be in a very much better and safer place than the one we occupy at the moment. For the longer term, beyond 2025, the task, of course, has to be to make the final leap from this minimisation point to actual global zero. We might wish, God knows we wish, that there were sort of a straight line continuum between the world as it now is and a nuclear weapon-free world, such that if real momentum is generated in this minimisation phase I'm talking about, then it can be expected to carry over into the elimination stage, making it possible to actually set a specific target date for achieving zero. But there isn't that kind of straight line continuum, and as a result, we just can't be specific about what a target date might be, or can't be credibly specific. We have to acknowledge the reality that there will be very large psychological confidence barriers to overcome, as well as technical ones about verification and enforcement, agonising fears that countries will have that others will break out, get a jump on them and so on, before all the nuclear armed states are willing to give up all their nuclear weapons. But even if it is impossible to set a credible specific target date, it's critically important to keep alive and in sharp focus the ultimate objective, which must remain abolition. The mountaintop might still be a long way away from what the four US statesmen have called the base camp or the vantage point, but it's essential that that mountaintop shine as a beacon in the sunlight and not be left as shrouded in mist. The biggest task of all for those of us who are determined to take on the challenge of nuclear disarmament may be to get policymakers, and for that matter the publics of which they occasionally take notice, to break out of the mindset that a nuclear weapons-free world is simply impossible, or if it is possible, simply undesirable because of the role that nuclear weapons are seen to have played in inhibiting various bloody-minded characters from going for each other's throats in the past, particularly during the Cold War. Part of the Commission's report will, I hope, be a long section working its way through all the major arguments of this kind that one most hears. For present purposes, let me just try to give you some response to perhaps the five most familiar of those arguments. First, the argument that nuclear weapons can't be uninvented, so there's no point in trying to eliminate them. My predecessor, Alexander Downer, for one, seemed to regard this as an absolute knockout argument of a recent article of his in the Adelaide Advertiser as any guide. Well, my short response to him or to anyone else is that, of course, nuclear weapons cannot be uninvented any more than any other human invention. But, like chemical and biological weapons, other weapons of mass destruction, they can be outlawed. And Australia, incidentally, has a very proud record in advancing both those other causes. The two basic requirements for effective abolition are verification and enforcement procedures capable of responding and detecting and responding swiftly and effectively to moves toward rearmament, and states being convinced that they could protect their vital interests without them. No one denies that satisfying these conditions will be much harder in the case of nuclear weapons than anything else, but the fact that knowledge of how to make them will persist is not in itself any reason at all not to try to achieve their abolition. The second argument that one often hears is that nuclear weapons have deterred and will continue to deter war between the major powers. It is hard to contest head-on the almost universally held and entirely intuitive view that most people have that the absence of great power conflict since 1945 must be at least in part attributed to the fear of nuclear war. On the face of it, nuclear weapons on the other side will always provide a formidable argument for caution, and it does seem that they generated a degree of mutual respect and careful handling between the US and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and for that matter, one has to acknowledge, between India and Pakistan since 1998, although I have stories of my own to tell about the command and control arrangements as I've currently found them between those two countries. That said, it's not clear that there's any evidence for the view that Soviet leaders, any more than the United States counterparts, were determined to actually go to war at any particular time and were only deterred by the existence of the other's nuclear weapons. And for all the careful handling, there were dozens of false alarms on both sides during the Cold War years. The fact that nuclear war didn't erupt from technical malfunction or decision-maker miscalculation should, to an important degree, be attributed, as I've already indicated, to sheer dumb luck. Moreover, I think it would be quite wrong to say that nuclear weapons ushered in any kind of an age of peace elsewhere, for in many respects the Cold War, if we cast our minds back, the Cold War years were very, very bloody indeed. And it's quite possible that nuclear deterrence, if it did work, allowed actually more killing to take place than it prevented during that period in Vietnam, Afghanistan, for a start. Third argument you hear is that nuclear weapons will deter any large-scale conventional attacks. And certainly what do you say about that? Well, I think what you can say is this, that factors other than the possession of nuclear weapons or explosive devices can certainly explain why the United States, Russia, China, the UK, France, India, Pakistan and North Korea have not been subject to large-scale attacks so far. States and societies have learned from the devastation of World War II and the defeat of aggressors in almost every war since. The enormous costs of war have to be weighed against any potential gains in starting them. Globalisation intensifies the cost of territorial aggression, as economic interdependence, especially in finance, leaves all states now susceptible to isolation by others in a way that simply wasn't the case before. While this can't be proved either way, it does not seem likely that large-scale confrontations would become more likely in the absence of nuclear weapons. There would still be, in other words, compelling economic, political, military incentives to prevent disputes between major powers escalating into all-out confrontation. Then you hear the argument that nuclear weapons will deter any chemical or biological weapons attack. Some nuclear-armed states do cite the threat of chemical or biological weapons as necessitating their retention of nuclear weapons. But I think it has to be said that someone who's studied this stuff pretty closely, this inflates out of all proportion the danger of such attacks. While certainly terrible in their own way if used on a large scale, and biological weapons have the potential to do rather more damage than chemical ones in this respect, neither of these weapons are ever likely to be as extensive, efficient or varied in their destructive effects as nuclear weapons, which, despite the regular treatment of all of them together of weapons of mass destruction, do remain absolutely in a category of their own. However dire the consequences, societies would find it less hard to recover from chemical and biological than from nuclear attack. It's very difficult, extremely difficult, to paint plausible scenarios that would threaten destruction from these sources on such a scale as to begin to make nuclear, as distinct from conventional retaliation, a proportional, necessary and therefore credible response.